personally, I prefer smaller groups because that way you can actually probably get a lot more, back and forth idea generation and stuff like that. And I definitely require it for this project. So this project is very much a work in progress right now, in the sense that a lot of the data has been, most all the data has been collected, but it's actually been presented at a conference as well. But as with most of these things, I'm still sort of parsing out and teasing out what exactly I want to emphasize and focus on in a written manuscript for a journal. So, as you probably got from Walter's very flattering description, a lot of my work is focused on environmental organizing, and I do a lot of what's often called applied research, which basically means that I'm particularly interested in the issues and the complexities facing practitioners on the ground, whether they're natural resource management people, or organizational sustainability people, or corporate responsibility people. And I try to connect those real-life problems, those problems on the ground, with theory. And I try to build theory based on those applied issues that we see around us. So let me tell you a little bit about the rationale for this particular study. If you are remotely interested in the issue of food, you will recognize that all of our food, pretty much in terms of production, distribution, and of course consumption, is extremely focused on this vast, intricate, and complex global network. And collectives called multi-stakeholder initiatives, or MSIs, have really cropped up in terms of importance. And these MSIs are really a combination of, they're a network. A combination implies simply summation, whereas it's much more complex. They're interconnected networks of nonprofits, both local and international, governments, again at different levels of government, think tanks, community bodies, of course, and of course companies at different levels as well. And all of these different MSIs, they're really focused on different aspects of whether it's production, whether it's distribution, whether it's consumption. Well, the goal of all of these MSIs increasingly is to connect all of these disparate actors to really ensure a little bit more voice, a little bit more transparency, and yes, sustainability in the food system as well. Generally, the way they understand sustainability is in terms of ensuring access, equitable access to people around the world, keeping in mind the fact that we have an explosion. We've been having an explosion in population for a long time, and of course contemporary shocks to the system, like climate change, for instance, is a huge one. So with that in mind, for me, the research question, the guiding question for this project was, well, how do these MSIs really think about, how do they communicatively enact food sustainability in their everyday work? And I'll get to what I mean by communicatively enact soon, because that's what I mean by really connecting theory to practice. So if you look at the literature on sustainability in food systems, there's a very broad, very interdisciplinary literature on this, and it really tends to focus on three main aspects: production, distribution, and consumption. Production, consumption, and socioeconomic issues. So the first strand of research on production tends to look at things like supply chains, for instance, technological advancements, refrigeration, for instance, to allow transport and greater resilience of food crops. And then local alternatives have also cropped up quite a lot when you think about production. Now, local alternatives like, of course, organic or non-GMO, or just down the street, geographically local modes of production. The literature, however, makes a really good point, though, that local alternatives are not necessarily always sustainable in the sense that they claim to be. In some ways, that might actually result in greater carbon emissions. In some ways, they might, whether it's through refrigeration, for instance, or transportation. So So the literature generally does tend to caution us about taking these local production modes a little critically rather than at face value. Consumption in terms of sustainability has really looked at the health issues, the risks of contamination, and of course markets and access. Who's got access to food, the right kind of food in different markets. So you've heard of the concept of the food desert, for instance, which has been applied quite a lot to Detroit in the past. So a lot of that literature tends to look at access and markets. And then finally, the socioeconomic issues of food sustainability tends to look at the meanings, the semantics involved. When we say that something is sustainable, what do we really mean? How do people understand what food access really mean? What does access really mean in different contexts and regions? The socioeconomic strand of this literature also is very much attuned to the economic interests at stake, especially if you think about how different large companies as well as MSIs might actually have very vested corporate interests. If you think about here in Michigan, for instance, there's been an ongoing controversy about to what extent should we allow Nestle and other water bottling companies, for instance, to use water from the Great Lakes at a ridiculously low cost. So the economic interest aspects become crucial for this strand of the literature. Where does communication come in? And this is what I meant. This is where I sort of go into the communicative enactment aspect. So broadly from the communication literature, I take this broad understanding that communicative structures and processes become really important in terms of how ordinary people, how everyday actors make sense of their experiences, the experiences of everyday life, as well as key concepts. So if you work at Nestle, for instance, it is your everyday interaction, the communication around you, that helps you make sense of what it means to be an employee at Nestle, and also what it means for you to really think about sustainable water supply as a broader context. So the research, for instance, has looked at the role of media, tools, and technologies to connect disparate actors together. It's also looked at a lot of community-based efforts and also broader systemic structural efforts, especially in terms of how all of these communities and organizations sort of collaborate and coordinate their work together. So that is definitely one aspect that communication becomes important for me in this project. The other takeaway for me from the communication literature is the concept of communicative work, which basically says that every time you do any sort of work, you really engage in communication as well. If you think about your jobs, for instance, you have to coordinate with people, you have to talk, you have to, even when you're writing reports, you are crafting messages that need to be understood by other people within the organization. So this strand of the literature says that everyday communicative practices, whether it's writing, talking, message designing, collaborating, discussing, these are vital to do work. And as a result of this doing of work through communication, this obviously affects the broader frames, the broader meanings of different concepts that work is supposed to be doing. So the takeaway for this is, in order to really understand how multi-stakeholder initiatives around food sustainability really do their work, in order to understand how these MSIs really frame this concept of food sustainability, you have to go a little deeper and sort of look at what the different employees and workers and partners at these MSIs are really involved in their everyday work. So I sort of switched that around the first time around. Also important to note that their everyday work and the communication of everyday work does not necessarily always perpetuate these broader preferred frames of meaning. It can actually challenge them as well, so that it is important to also look at the tensions at stake. These tensions can be problematic, but they can also be productive because they can actually force people to come to grips that, there's an issue over here, and so we sort of have to go back to basics and sort of rework how we do things from the ground up. So, a lot of this is probably going to become a little clearer when we go into some of the data. So just to recap again, the research question was, how do food MSIs really communicatively enact sustainability in their everyday work? I used a case study approach for this particular project. I looked at the agricultural markets team of a large international nonprofit. We are being recorded, so I can't really use their name, but it's huge, and it works with governments and the United Nations at a very large scale. And so the data was composed of semi-structured interviews with team members. Actually, I interviewed 10 of 12 staff members. I also shadowed the entire group for about a whole week in their Washington, D.C. head office. And I also collected a number of relevant texts, white papers, reports, brochures, which were thematically analyzed as well. So this is very much a qualitative case study. In terms of data analysis, I used a method called a pragmatic iterative method, which again is very well suited to really looking at real life applied problems on the ground and then helping build theory through these real life situations. It's especially attuned to looking at how real life is complex, it's messy, there are bound to be tensions, and those tensions can actually generate important theoretical insights. So the 25 codes were really resorted under 3 broad heads, and that's really what I'm going to put as my preview of my findings. So the first broad heading was Agro team members definitely focused on building systemic resilience in food systems, and this was really accomplished through markets. The second broad heading was that food sustainability was understood as an issue of goal optimization and risk management. So these concepts of optimizing goals and risk management were very key for food sustainability. And secondly, that although it was sort of well expected that Agro would be intensely engaged in relationship building with their corporate partners, with their government partners, it was interesting to note that their relationships with their secondary and tertiary stakeholders were also really important, and it did pay a lot of attention to these other secondary stakeholders, these hidden stakeholders, if you will. So, just to go into a little bit of detail for each of these heads, not showing you actual examples of the data, but I will just talk through some of those examples and cover some of the broader issues that I'm seeing. So for the first head, which was really all about building the systemic resilience through a markets-based approach, the emphasis at Agro is very much on broader systems of production rather than localized conditions. And the argument is that although this seems very top-down, they felt that this was really the only way to provoke that long-lasting, institutional, tangible change, which might not result if you do ground-up kinds of transformation. What does the markets approach mean for them? And so I did not make up this term, the markets approach, by the way. This was very much something that they came up with. In qualitative research, we call this an in vivo term. That the term originated from the data participants, research participants themselves. They engaged in the markets approach through 2 main methods. Number one, they coordinated commodity roundtables, which really brought in these major players from around the world, whether it's around soy or water, for instance, or other major crops and food products or goods around the world. The other way that they focus on the markets approach was just general corporate engagement, especially with risk analysis. One of the things that cropped up over and over was their recognition that companies haven't really figured out how to deal with these issues like climate change, for instance. How do they understand their existing and their future potential risks? And so this is where Agro team basically came in with their really sophisticated life cycle analysis and other methods of modeling to really help companies have a better forecast of the attendant risks. There were tensions involved, however, even though for the most part they focused on this broad frame of systemic resilience, markets approach. They recognized that this often left them always scrambling. So they were often very reactive. And so they were, even though they might want to be very proactive, they often said, we honestly don't have time to do that because we're looking at every single aspect of the system. And so it's very difficult sometimes, not sometimes, often, for them to actually create a proactive strategy. As a result, they were also scrambling to continuously learn. Now, we often talk about continuous learning as a good thing, and it can be a good thing, but it can also be incredibly difficult if you don't think that you have the resources and the support to actually engage in that continuous learning, but your job and your work really depends on it at the same time. Also, there were tensions around scope definition because they were really looking at this broad systemic level. Often enough, they were constantly left grappling, well, what exactly are we focused on? What part of the system should we focus on a little bit more than the others? Maybe we shouldn't focus on any single part of the system. But so defining their scope was something they had a lot of struggle with continuously. Looking at the next broad head, just checking on time to make sure I'm doing good, okay. The next broad head really looked at sustainability as a matter of goal optimization through risk management, right? So what does this mean for Agro and their broader, the broader MSI? Well, this basically meant that well, not what it meant. Let me focus on how framing this sustainability as risk management helped them in some ways. It helped them because they recognized that the people that they worked with, say the Nestle person or the Procter and Gamble person that they worked with, often had an uphill battle of their own in their own organizations to convince and persuade their supervisors and top management in their organizations. So they recognize that by framing sustainability as goal optimization, risk management, really helped their representatives sort of argue up the chain in their own organization, and this was vital for their own broader goal of transformation. The other interesting thing that this framing thing did was that it emphasized R&D. And who is qualified to do R&D? Well, Agro, of course. So in lots of ways, although they might not have anticipated it, this might not have been a strategic decision, maybe it was, no one really admitted it to be, this really did cement Agro's place as convener of the MSI. You can't really have this MSI and food sustainability without the central convener who is so focused on R&D and risk management. It also did emphasize shared problem solving. It did emphasize collective organizing, which was a much more charitable way of reading the benefits of framing sustainability in this way. At the same time, there were tensions over here as well. Tool efficacy was a huge issue because they recognized that a lot of tools that were trendy, like LCA, were not the panacea that they were often framed as being by their corporate partners. And so they were very specific that LCA is a useful, sophisticated risk management tool, but there are clear blind spots. And we have to understand that not all tools do what they're often, what the hype says that they actually do. They also recognize that thinking about sustainability as risk management did create somewhat of a blinkered view, especially if it, as far as local concerns were concerned. What are smaller scale farmers and smaller scale actors on the food production chain dealing with? That view often was sort of hidden away from Agro's broader strategizing. They also noted that although this framing supposedly emphasized shared problem solving, collective organizing, knowledge sharing remained a huge problem, largely because a lot of the partners in the MSI had very concerns about proprietary knowledge, right? And so they didn't really want to give other partners access to data which they felt were relevant to their own business interests. So knowledge sharing still did remain a huge issue despite this broader frame of risk management. Finally, really looking at the broader stakeholder networks. They emphasized transformation. Transformation not only for the broader food system, but also transformation for all of the different actors in this broader stakeholder network. So on the one hand, as I said, it's sort of natural that you expect them to focus on scaling up existing programs with existing corporate partners. But in addition to that, they also focused on very targeted messaging for media actors who they felt would be really influential for the corporate partners that they worked with. And I'm reminded by Elena's recent work on what was the term you used? Deceptive communication. Stealth marketing. In a way, this reminds me now a lot of stealth marketing. This was stealth messaging, recognizing that, well, if we get a favorable or maybe an unfavorable review or a write-up in Forbes, our corporate partners will pay attention to that, and they will therefore be more amenable to what we're telling them to do. So, stealth targeted messaging. And interesting enough, despite their broader emphasis on the system, on the top-down management, they did, at least the staff members, did reach out to local small-scale actors now and then, when it was possible for them, when they actually got funding to go to different regions on the ground and engage with local small-scale farmers. They did this for two reasons. They found it incredibly useful to get first-hand information about really what's happening in that particular context, and they also found that this really helped them know about the political trends on the ground. What's really happening in terms of political, social movements that might help or jeopardize Agro's broader efforts. Interestingly enough, they also found it useful to engage in a sort of indirect symbiosis with more confrontation-oriented activists. So they talked a lot about how, even though there were no direct contacts or linkages with, say, Greenpeace activists, they did note that because Greenpeace and other confrontation-oriented activist groups made an issue so salient, so germane, it actually made their corporate partners more willing to work with Agro, right? So Greenpeace was like the stick and Agro was the carrot in order for this broader MSI to actually work more effectively. What also worked was these indirect informal networks among people who work in this broader sustainability space. So you're not part of the same organization, you're not technically supposed to be interacting or passing information on, but a lot of these activists and workers know each other. And so there was that informal networking as well. Finally, interestingly enough, another hidden stakeholder for Agro was their broader organization. Remember, they were the agricultural markets team of this large international nonprofit organization. Well, the large INPO often saw the Agro team as sellouts. And Agro got a lot of flack from a lot of the other team members from the other teams in this parent IMPO. And so they really tried very hard, or at least they said they did, in terms to try to disrupt those traditional silos and to say that, well, yes, we're working through the markets, we do have a markets approach, but our broader goal is very much transformation of the food system in a more progressive direction. So the tension over here really permeating across all of these different aspects was the visibility versus the invisibility of engagement. In lots of ways, every single one of these stakeholders, these actors, are not directly, are not really those actors they should be more concerned with. These are the invisible actors. But in so many ways, these invisible actors, these invisible stakeholders play a huge role in a broader project of food sustainability that Agro team members really absolutely recognized. But they still, they were hampered in ways to reach out to them more directly, whether it's in terms of funding to actually go to local contexts, or whether it's in terms of the optics of the situation. They can't really reach out to Greenpeace because that will entirely destroy their cover, right? So the optics of visibility and invisibility was a major underlying tension of this of their engagement over here. So to wrap up, to recap my findings, 3 broad headings in terms of how Agro really communicatively enacts food sustainability. Systemic resilience via markets, risk management for goal to really accomplish those goals, and really engaging with broader stakeholders networks, not necessarily those primary stakeholders, but also the broader ones in order to really transform the broader system. 2 main takeaways, for me at least, and I'd love to hear what your takeaways are, because that will really be helpful as I write out this manuscript for journal publication. Number 1, this entire process is deeply tensional, and as the literature suggests, tension making can be both productive and it can hamper the best intentions as well. It involves sense-making paradoxes for this team. So in the sense that we cannot simply say that these actors, well, they knew what they were getting into, or they're not even thinking about the local issue. They're so ensconced in their own little bubble. That's not true. They might be in a bubble of sorts, but the bubble is transparent. They are aware of the tensions, the paradoxes involved in terms of how they think about their work and what their work is supposed to accomplish. Some examples, for instance, we talked about scope definition issues, we talked about tool efficacy, and we talked about invisibility as well. And it remains to be seen in terms of how these sense-making paradoxes actually play out on the ground. In some cases, members sort of focus on one pole of the paradox as opposed to the other in different time frames in order to get their work done. In other cases, they might well be, they might be in a double bind of sorts. We can't really progress because both these poles of the paradox are simply too problematic for us. The other thing to keep in mind is that although these big MSIs hate thinking of themselves in terms of political partnerships, in terms of political stances, relationships of power are infused throughout. And it's across each and every one of these different frames. Whether it's thinking about markets recourse, which is entirely top-down, it's very hierarchical. If you think about what kinds of tools are preferred as opposed to other tools, what tools get funding and political backing compared to other tools, and of course, ground-level politics on the ground, which really affects the potential efficacy of the programs. So with that, thank you so much for your time. And that's my contact details. I'm also on Twitter. If you're on Twitter, on social media, I spend awfully too much time on Twitter entirely. But thank you so much, and I'd love to hear what you talk about.
have lots of questions, but thanks for the great talk. So I guess maybe the starting question is in one of those tensions that you're talking about, which has to do with time. So I'm curious about how, if you have a market-based approach, and this is a problem for environmentalism more widely, right? And if, in fact, your own contract is maybe renewed or not renewed, and your labor is time sensitive in some way because of the way markets pressure your organization, then how do you reconcile that with the need to think past a contract? How do you really develop something sustainable that can think far enough ahead when it might be beyond the actual guarantee of your mandate, whatever that might be? So I guess that's another part of what you're talking about as scope definition, right? That it seems like just the long scale of environmental problems is fundamentally in conflict with market time a lot of the time. And I'm just wondering if they think about that, or if you saw how that was dealt with at all.
I think it's definitely part of the scope definition tensions. The INPO overall is incredibly large and rich.
Okay. I'm so curious about that.
They're really not in danger of losing funds.
And their position wherever they are.
They're incredibly well positioned.
Okay.
Their position, I mean, their headquarters are in DC, so they're incredibly well positioned. The issue in terms of time is not so much for cost, therefore it's more in terms of in terms of partnership, right? And you see that with, I think, most nonprofit action. Well, to what extent? Because nonprofits alone can't do all the work. They will require, especially if it's a systemic structural issue, they will require buy-in from governments and companies and all of these other stakeholders. And people do, I mean, these actors do end up, with fatigue, donation fatigue, partnership fatigue. And so it's a question of how do you sort of keep on rejuvenating and remarketing and rebranding what you're doing. So in order for them to do that, they have to show results. And so again, the markets approach and the top-down approach was seen as a good way to show tangible results on the ground, so that people, if it's a Procter & Gamble, for instance, will say, well, okay, we're making a definite difference in this situation, and it's not simply going to die away. I mean, there are tensions, of course, but so the time issue, that's great. The mandate. At what time did they sort of step away from a particular region or a particular context as well, which is another issue which I'm facing with actually a Detroit-based nonprofit focused on building entrepreneurs. And they're like, well, we've done this, we've been very successful, but how long can we continue to do this in this particular zone? At what time do we step out? If we do step out, are we sure that everything's not going to collapse right away?
Great.
Yeah. All right. So I was paying attention to like polar opposites. And I said that so basically they're genetically modifying food to help feed world hunger, but in reality it's promoting obesity. So I wanted to say, how do you feel about? They said they have the first ever lab-grown chicken strips made from animal cells that require no real chickens. So, I mean, is that good? Is that bad? Because they kind of just sneak it on in there. You just think, I thought chicken was chicken. Now I'm eating like a chicken made from molecules, but it has the same protein.
Well, all chicken is made of molecules.
Well, yeah. That's how they get you.
It's good for the chickens.
Yeah.
So, and that goes to, again, that top-down markets approach. That was an issue that I did press because you hear, because you have the slow food movement, you have the non-GMO movement, of course, and at least in Europe, at least that's a very powerful movement, much more than it is in the United States. The way that Agro sort of framed it was you require these technological advancements. Local food by itself is simply not going to be enough to feed the number of, the huge number of people that we presently have in the world. And so you do need technological advancements, you do need GMOs in some ways. And again, they use the science because a lot of the science, to be fair, a lot of the scientific literature out there says that there's really nothing conclusive proved against GMO food or GMO crops. So again, it's really weighing the risks and the benefits, going back to that risk management approach. On the one hand, yes, yes, there are cultural concerns, but there is no scientific evidence that it's unhealthy, and it highly enhances yield. It can feed more people overall. It can be made more cheaper as well for access. And so that's how Agro sort of still very much focuses on top-down. It doesn't matter if it's GMO, that's totally fine. So then they would view your views as cultural concerns that need to be addressed through cultural messaging and campaigns in order to make you change your mind and recognize that there's nothing wrong in eating molecules.
Are you a vegan if you eat something that's chicken, but it's not from a chicken? That was my follow-up question. Could you still eat it? Because by definition, you're a vegan. You're not killing animals. It's not from an egg or whatever. But it's not. It's the future. Yeah.
What's it from?
Just said sales. Chicken sales.
Maybe like part of what you're bringing up is this question of whose culture are they sort of creating the shift towards? Because it seems like it's kind of a global culture of a marketplace instead of a regional culture. I mean, that's where the Europeans and the slow food movement have a bigger problem with GMOs because they're not, even though slow foods does pay attention to the market perspective, but it sort of rewinds before that, and it's more the sort of local cultures of food preparation, and it sees the way GMOs, even if they're not bad for you on one end, right? They're bad for farmers who don't want to buy those kinds of seeds. They're bad for diversity of the crop. So it seems as though there's sort of some middle point, and you can look on either side of it, and they're looking, as you were saying at the very beginning, only on one side. They've chosen that.
Right.
But I wonder how much they think about the consequences of starting.
So they look at the structural issues. So they're not averse to fair trade. In fact, fair trade is an important part of the broader sustainability frame that they're framing, for food supplies, food systems globally. In a way, this frame was inevitable because, again, they're a large global nonprofit. It makes sense for them to focus on the global system, and it makes really sense for them to focus on global delivery rather than local delivery. But on the other hand, I think what complicates the situation obviously are these informal networks, right? And so they act in complementary roles with each other. The local activists and the global risk analysts, they do complement each other to create hopefully a more sustainable food supply system.
Yeah, and then I guess my last question is, okay, so you're making food cheaper, easier, maybe even better, healthier, but still, like, if you're poor, you still can't afford it. So, I mean, like, how affordable do you have to make it so everybody can afford it?
So, is that a question for me, or what? What's your question?
I guess the question is, like, who are you really helping? Like, the richer get richer, they can afford organic or non-organic, or it doesn't really quite matter. But you're trying to make it so much plentiful that somebody in, let's say, a third world country can afford the meat. How long is that going to take? I mean, I don't even know if there's a question. Are you really changing, like?
Well, that's a comment more than a question. But I'll respond to that. in terms of how I think Agro would respond, okay? And they would essentially respond saying, well, for example, you talk about chicken, so let's go with chicken. McDonald's is a huge partner of these MSIs. They focus on beef, for instance, the beef roundtables. So a lot of their emphasis is on how can we create, or create sounds sciencey, but in a way it is sciencey actually. How can we sort of create access to cheap but nutritious beef or chicken for customers at different ends of the cost spectrum, right? As costs go, McDonald's is really cheap compared to, say, I don't know, Red Robin or something else like that. Does McDonald's use organic beef?
Yeah.
Well, it uses in some of its products, it does, right? McDonald's actually did a huge sustainability push a few years ago, and they've sort of had to climb down a little bit from that because they were I think some of the changes they were making were hurting their margins a little bit too much
Yeah,
for
they like
their
to change it too
shareholders.
fast.
And so they're still very much involved in these global food sustainability supply chains and MSIs, and they still wield a lot of clout. But what's interesting also is that you have these team members, the risk analysts, who need to coordinate with the McDonald's as well as governments, as well as regulators, to sort of come to a decision, to sort of come to a broader collective policy or framework that everyone is going to agree to. That's not easy.
Alright, that's all I got.
Yeah, it sounds like I drank the Kool-Aid, and I really haven't. But I'm sort of explaining this from the perspective of the participants. I do think that there are issues, that there are problematic issues in terms of their framing, and that's why the tensions is really important to recognize. That this is not a hunky-dory, everything's fine with the world kind of strategy. There are problems in terms of how far this can go, in terms of the scope and the actual effectiveness of their program, as you pointed out.
My last question is, so everything says GM on it. I be looking at the baby bottle pop. Every candy is now genetically modified. Do you think just putting the label on it is enough? Like, you shouldn't tell me that. Well, they tell you, but I mean, like for people who don't read the label.
Mm-hmm. I think it goes both ways. Everything which has got the organic label on it is not organic, not by a long shot. Whole Foods has got into a huge problem about that recently, and so have other food suppliers and food retailers. So I think we need to be skeptical and really look at beyond the label, but also look at the ingredients. I think you're fair to say that not many people do that, but again, that's then the job for community activists and nonprofits to really create a campaign or some sort of method to convince more people to pay attention to what they consume.
Being in PR, man, it just makes you think about everything.
Yeah.
Social marketing class with Jane Fitzgibbon. That's your project for that class.
Oh no. Sheree is a graduate student and I'm already busy. So but I do appreciate it. Oh no. It doesn't get easier. Yes.
Okay. Thanks so much.